Để tiếp tục chương trình thì chúng tôi xin trân trọng giới thiệu
diễn giả đầu tiên, giáo sư Kempner từ trường Southern Horizon University.
Good morning, distinguished guests, professors, Mr. Ambassador, Rector. It's very nice to be here, and I have Dr. Neon Bick. Dr. Bick, I get to call her because she's my student, so I thank her very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, my focus is on international development. I've been very interested in the role that universities play in economic and social development. And so I've had a chance to study in a number of countries, not just developing countries. I've worked quite a bit in Japan, and Brazil, and Chile, and Mexico, and of course the United States. And I've had a chance to compare a lot of institutions, a lot of ways of going about it. And there is certainly no one solution, so my presentation today is more just to discuss some of my thoughts and some of my findings, and then we'll have a little time for discussion, I hope, at least as the day continues. What I'd like to begin with is looking at modernistic versus postmodernistic concepts. And the way we distinguish between modernism and postmodernism is modernism is what we think of with traditional buildings and structures, and postmodernism is perhaps what we're in now, the uses of technology, from coming around the world to talk to each other. This is more of a postmodern world. So it makes us think in terms of different forms of education. So what's the purpose of education? This first point I have is a concern that we have in the United States is, are we simply reproducing the existing social structure? That does education just keep everybody in the same class status and the same areas? Or are we interested in giving people new options and democratizing the notion of education, that people from different walks of life can move into education in different ways? This is also the issue, is the purpose of education just so people can accumulate capital? Somebody goes to education, goes into higher education so they can make more money. Or are we socializing people to different concepts and different ways of understanding? So we have on one hand a very monetary notion of education. People go into higher education to improve themselves financially, but on the other hand, we're looking for people to improve themselves academically and socially as well. So this we get into this notion of the public good versus the private good of education. And the distinction here is the purpose of education to promote the public good, the whole country, the whole world, or is the purpose of education just for the private individual? It's to improve themselves economically or academically. So there's this balance that we have in the function of education. Are we looking at the public good, or are we looking at the private good? And here we get into issues of public education versus private education, and who are the beneficiaries of these forms of education. This relates to the concept of individualism versus collectivism. In the United States, we have this great pride in the fact that we're a very individualistic society. We have a combination of 50 states that are really just sort of an affiliation of individual states in the Union. But collectivism, Japan is a good example of collectivism, that the idea of Japan as a collective society. And so education then has to function, whether it's focused on this notion of individualism, again, is the purpose of education to promote the private individual, or is the purpose of higher education for the collective good? And of course, it doesn't have to be either end, but there is a balance in here. And this is what we're looking for, is where do we find the best place for different kinds of universities? And there's a variety of different universities that can do different things. Vocational education universities, the liberal arts universities at different ends. And so when we're talking about education, we have to look at these concepts of individualism versus collectivism. And again, our respective cultures are different too in how we approach them. And this is that notion of culture, is that a function of higher education is to produce culture and to preserve culture. One of the dangers of education, when it becomes just vocational, we're just looking at people getting jobs, then we're losing the cultural part. Where do the artists come from? Where do the poets come from? Where do the ambassadors come from? Where do individuals come from if all we're looking at is a vocational kind of education? So again, we have to look at the full breadth of higher education. And again, this is that notion of individual productivity versus the collective notion. What's again the purpose of higher education? This takes me to the notion of world rankings, and we can move to the next slide. Now, I'm not a big fan of the world rankings, and everybody seems to worry about the world rankings. And so my urge to you is stop worrying about the world rankings. It's a system that's meant for very specific purposes. And here we have the list of rankings, and there really are no surprises. If you haven't seen the list lately, it's the major US and UK universities. Why do we get to be best? But and that's a good question. And if you notice the listing, it's primarily private universities, Harvard, Stanford, and then the universities that are underlined in white, these are the public universities in the United States, like the University of California, Berkeley, UCLA, University of Washington, University of Oregon, where I'm from originally, and then now at Southern Oregon University. But the reason I give you these rankings is that there's no surprises. Almost in any listing, we see the same universities listed within the top 5 or the top 10. And these are all very good universities, all very noble universities. But the reason that they're on top is because they're very well funded. They're the top of the national universities. And the rankings are primarily done by China, because China needed to know where should it send our students as China developed. And so they developed the rankings. Well, who has the most Nobel Prize winners? Who has the biggest research funding? Who does the most publications? But this is not necessarily what universities need to be. So as I go around to different countries and talk to universities, don't worry about the national rankings or the international rankings. Worry about the rankings that are appropriate for your country, for your purpose of your education. I was just in Mexico not too long ago, and Mexico was very upset because the National University of Mexico was ranked very low on the global rankings, but they're the #2 university in South America. I said, so develop your own ranking for South America. So if I can encourage you not to worry about rankings, think about what's important for Vietnam, what's important for your region, and what's important for the purpose of the university. Next slide. Also with the rankings, if we could put dollar signs or money signs by each of those rankings, most of the rankings are based on who has the most money. So it's really not a very important ranking then. If you just find out who has the biggest endowments, then you know what are the universities with the highest rankings. And of course, we see Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Princeton up at the top. And a little bit of change in the public universities in the United States. Texas is very high because it has always had so much oil. University of Michigan used to be very high because it had all the cars, because the oil got put in Texas into the cars in Michigan and were made in Michigan. But those things are changing slightly as time goes on. But again, this is the idea that, okay, the rankings don't tell us very much. They tell us who are the wealthiest universities. And so again, we want to see what's the purpose of our university. Are we doing what's important for our region? Are we doing what's important for our country? Are we doing what's important for ourselves? And this goes back to weigh that balance. What's the public good versus the private good? What's the purpose of our university? What's the purpose of our systems? And these are the questions we need to ask ourselves as we move forward, not so much where we are in the rankings. The next slide, please. What's important is to understand education and the state. And this is the idea that what role does the university have for the state? And this can be a good thing, and it can be not such a good thing. Is the state intruding on the universities, or are the universities free to develop as they want? And so again, there's sort of this balance between the state and the university. In the U.S., the state does impose, because it has a lot of federal funding that goes in and can manipulate the market to a certain extent. But this isn't always bad, as we'll talk about. One of the concerns that the function of education is called a compensatory commodity. This is a difficult phrase to probably translate, I would imagine. But the idea is that sometimes higher education is seen as a gift that the middle class gets, or the upper middle class gets, to go to school. And so sometimes in some countries higher education is not so much seen as an economic tool as a way to give a gift to the middle class or give a gift to the upper middle class. And so this is a concern we have. Again, what's the function of education? It shouldn't necessarily be just a gift. It should be something that moves the entire country up. It allows people from all social classes to move up. It shouldn't just be seen as a gift for certain social classes or for certain individuals. So again, it's how do we broaden the notion of what is a university and what makes a good university for whom? This is a good question. It's what's a good university, but does it cover everybody? So we look at issues of national culture and then what's the purpose of education in helping understand national culture, promoting national culture, protecting national sovereignty. This is the idea that we have a culture of our individual nations, and they're important for us to keep, and these should be an important part of our universities, and so we should preserve the national culture. Again, don't worry about the rankings, because the rankings aren't interested in that. We're interested in what's helping us for our own individual countries. And then how can we distribute knowledge? One of the areas that's very important for me is high-status knowledge versus technical knowledge. And this is something that I don't know Vietnam well, but I've studied enough that I can see some of the parallels, is that the function of higher education can be just the liberal arts, preserving culture, promoting culture. But on the other hand, we have technical and vocational education, that people will learn specific knowledge. And so some universities focus on the liberal arts, whereas some technical schools, which can be universities as well, we have the community colleges in the United States you might be familiar with, that are focused on vocational and technical. And so there's this balance with how much vocational technical knowledge should be included in the universities, or do we have different sorts of universities? So one thing we've done in the United States is we have specific two-year schools that do vocational education. The German system is probably one of the best, I think, as far as how they deal with vocational education. But this is something that, where does this technical knowledge come from? I've studied Brazil a lot, and Brazil has a very, very good higher educational system at the very top, preserving culture and liberal arts, but they don't do very well in the middle for vocational knowledge. Vocational knowledge is just sort of left for people on their own. So they're beginning to figure out, as Brazil is becoming more industrialized, of course, what do we do? Where do all those people come from in the middle vocational levels? So this is an area, and a question I have for you is where is the technical knowledge coming from? And is it high-level knowledge, middle-level knowledge, and who has access to that knowledge as well? Next slide. There is, of course, an important function of what makes a good university, and what's the role of the socialization part and globalization of knowledge. And this is the idea that are we doing our university work for corporate good or individual good? And it can really be both. The idea that, well, who are the beneficiaries of education? And again, this is another question of what makes a good university. Is it who benefits from going to the university? Does the society benefit? Does the individual benefit? Well, hopefully it's both. But what's the balance between sending? Who should pay for it? Is it public knowledge? Is it private knowledge? And who are the beneficiaries of this? And so this gets into the middle part there, is what's the role of the nation state? What's the role of the national culture? What's the role of the university as one moves forward? And so is the university a producer of knowledge? And this is a favorite area of mine because I spend a lot of time doing research. And so that is, do we create universities to produce knowledge? And what makes a good university? And so again, on the rankings, some of the rankings are, well, the universities that produce the most knowledge, unfortunately in English papers, which is not fair, they're considered the best universities. Well, that's a function of the university. And there are some universities that their purpose is definitely to produce knowledge, but other universities is to inculcate culture and to teach. Again, the preservation of culture. I think that the richness of your culture that I had fun learning and studying as much about. I'll go out in the last couple of days and I'll see statues and I'll run home and Google who that person was and learn all about the culture. And so this is an important part of what universities do, is that to teach the culture and help people understand the society and how it fits in with the larger global system. And of course, this is always the problem, is how much do we get to keep our own culture and how much do we be part of the global culture. And this is a very, very important function of universities now, is that how do we mix and match with the global culture. Next slide. Well, there are, of course, a number of problems that we have in higher education. I'll go through these fairly quickly because I want to get to some of the solutions, if I can. Is that an important area for me called the public sphere. This is a book I just finished editing with some colleagues of mine from Australia and Mexico and the US. And what function does the university play in public debate in the public sphere is that we have a wonderful array of professors and rectors here today. And so how do you participate in the functioning of the culture and the functioning of the government? What's the role of the university in the public sphere? And in some countries, I'm studying Saudi Arabia also right now, universities don't have a big role in the public sphere. And so they're fighting to have a larger role, specifically women's universities that I'll talk about a little bit. But what role do universities play? Where are university presidents? Where are university rectors? Where are university professors? In the public sphere, in the public debate of social things, of cultural things. And so what makes a good university, in my mind, is a university that's highly engaged in the public sphere. We have professors, we have administrators who are heavily involved in public notions and public ideas and cultural notions. And so to me, that's not a ranking on the globalization ranking, but that should be a ranking for our own universities. How do we participate? And how are we involved in the culture? How are we involved in society at large? And this is the notion of globalization. Unfortunately, globalization, a lot of it is just Americanization, and which is embarrassing to us in the United States because a lot of the notion of globalization is how many U.S. companies, how many English papers are written. And this shouldn't be globalization specifically, but it's that larger notion of how we participate and how do we broaden, how do we have more academic journals that are not just in English? How do we get rewards for scholars who aren't just only publishing in English and only doing research that's valued as part of globalization? The philosophy of higher education, again, also relates to what is a good university. And so I think there's some issues here. None of these are mutually exclusive. We have the philosophy and purpose of the university is to promote reason, culture we've already talked about, and to promote capital, which is not all bad. Again, it's okay that one of the functions of the university is technical. And one of the functions of the university is to improve the quality of engineering, the quality of science, the quality of education, of course. And so this is capital accumulation to a certain extent, but it's okay as long as it's balanced with those cultural and social and globalization functions. So again, what's the broad purpose of a university? What's the broad purpose of a university system? My own state in Oregon is part of the university system, and so we have a very high-end liberal arts university, the University of Oregon, and then we have regional universities, which I moved to. I was at the University of Oregon. I became a university dean of the regional universities, and they have a different function, which is just fine because it covers the whole purpose of the state. So one university doesn't have to be everything. We can have a system that allows some universities to have one function, other universities to have a more regional function. And what's the balance of research that goes on at those places? And this is one of the issues that's very important to me, is the issue of access and equity. Is who gets access to the universities, and is it equitable? The equitable idea means, in the U.S., do we have people from all social classes and all races and all genders that are allowed access to the university? And so some universities can have more access, others as long as you have a system that incorporates all of those. Next slide, please. As I've been studying universities throughout the world, some of the same problems keep coming up, university after university. Now again, each country has its own cultural issues, of course, but there are some universal concerns that we all face, and one is national capacity. That is, do we have a system that's big enough to absorb everybody who wants to go to higher education, or everybody deserves to go to higher education? And how do we decide that? Do we do it by merit? Do we do it by testing? Do we do it by social class issues? Is it access just because you have the money to go? Another concern is lack of administration. and having been a university dean, I can attest to the lack of poor administration sometimes, is that often we have very, very poor system management. And universities often are run more by politics than by management or organization. And so what makes a good university is a university that has a good administration system as well, and good leadership, of course. And a concern that's very popular across the world now is quality assurance. How do we assure quality assurance, and what does that mean? Everybody talks a lot about quality assurance, but nobody's quite sure what it means. Does this mean good professors? Does this mean a good system? Does this mean good evaluation? Does this mean good students? And how do those students get there? And so before we can have assurance, quality assurance, we have to understand what it means, but it's a very good question to ask. And then the continued debate of financing higher education towards national development is that how should money be spent? How should money be allocated? I've worked with some very poor countries sometimes, and although I study higher education, sometimes I have to explain to them, I think it's better if you put your money into kindergarten, elementary schools, and high schools, because it's a scarce resource, and perhaps you can't afford to do higher education yet. Everybody wants to, but maybe your money is better spent at the lower levels. And we can figure out something else with a two-year college, or we can do mutual cooperation across other countries for higher education. One of the concerns is, what's the value of research? For me, research is very, very important, but it's very expensive. And so, what countries and what universities can afford to do research? And so I'll talk about this again a little bit. I think we can all afford and should be doing local research. We don't necessarily have to do global research. And I think that our university should be rewarded for providing local research. Curriculum is always a problem. It's always very expensive, so often universities will just do the least expensive history classes, and not do science because science is too expensive. And so this is a concern about how money is being spent, and that leads to a lack of technical programs often. Next slide. Some of the problems with higher education, again related to what makes a good university, is that what happens if we have high dropout rates? And often this is caused because of isolation. Students are thrown in and isolated, don't connect very well, and it's very expensive for us to lose those students. Lack of infrastructure often causes a high dropout rate. And so we spend all this money to bring students in, and we should keep them. And if we don't, why not? High status versus low status knowledge. Again, this is the idea that technical science versus history, perhaps. Liberal arts versus the technical programs. And so what's the balance that we want in our universities? And again, what makes the best university for us? Should we have high status knowledge, high technical programs and science programs? Or are we okay with low status programs where people may not be able to find jobs, but it's still liberal arts and it's preservation of the culture? So these are important. And again, where do our physicians and scientists and lawyers and professors come from? And so if we're building a country, and we're all developing, it doesn't matter how developed we are as countries, we're all developing, we're all changing. And so the idea that how do we get a continuous supply of knowledgeable people to run the infrastructures of the country? In the U.S., we have specific problems with race and income and region gaps, because we have lots of problems between whites, blacks, Hispanics, who has access to education, graduation rates, and it's something that we need to look at continually in the United States. How equitable are we being to who's graduating? Paulo Freire, hopefully many of you have heard of, is a Brazilian educator whose concept of banking education, to me, was one of the best things that we talked about as a philosopher of education. So often in education, our idea is just to bank information in students' heads. And then at the end of the term, we recall that information. And that's called education. So Paulo Freire warns us to avoid at all costs the banking form of education, where we have an educational system that's set up where we just put deposits in students' heads and then recall them at the end. And that's not very much learning. It's just spitting back information. So we're really not promoting things very much along those lines. He calls this pedagogy for the oppressed. Next slide, please. concerns is that in thinking about what's a good university, is that we think of a universal model for all countries when we don't all have the same cultures and we don't all operate the same way. And so this is just an example. It's called organizational triangles. And it's the idea, we'll start at the bottom with the U.S. It's in the U.S. we have a very flat system. We're fiercely independent. We have everybody gets to participate for good and for bad. And so we have a very flat top. And so we're a much more informal approach to universities. And so while we do have a rector, the rector has to share everything, or the president has to share everything with the faculty. Often the faculty runs the university. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work. And other countries have a more formal structure where it's a sharper peak. And this is like Thailand, France, and Greece, where the peak is a little more structured, the top is a little more important and has a little more control, and there's less control at the bottom. And then the steepest here is looking at Turkey, India, Malaysia, and Mexico, where it's very, very steep. And the idea that the organization is more of a top-down. Again, the bottom is the U.S. is very flat. I didn't find Vietnam on the list, so you'll have to guess where you think Vietnam will be. But the important thing to remember is none of these are right and none of these are wrong. This is not an explanation of which is better and which is worse. It's an understanding of our cultures and how we differ in our cultures. And so what we have to understand is, given the culture that we have, what makes a good university, what makes a good university system, given the way we operate and organize ourselves culturally. And so what we do in the U.S. is very, very different than what Mexico should be doing, or what Brazil should be doing. I happen to know Brazil and Mexico fairly well. And they are very, very steep, they're very formal structures. The hierarchy is very clear. Whereas in the United States, sometimes you're never quite sure who's in charge, which is sometimes good and sometimes not so good. And so, but you have to decide what's the best fit for the culture. And again, what makes a good university given your cultural circumstances? And so a lot of the questions is, okay, where do we fit as a country? And it's not that, again, this is a good or bad chart. This is the idea that we have to understand what's our system, what works for our culture. Next slide, please. I just want to quickly talk about some of the work that I'm doing, and to wrap up very quickly. I've done a lot of work in Japan, and I think most of you are familiar with the concept of the salaryman in Japan. And Japan's education system was an excellent system for creating the salaryman of the 1990s, but that's not necessarily the best system that they need for now into the 2000s. And so some of Japan's developing struggle is what to do with the university system they have in place that worked very, very well in the 1990s, but not so well today. And so it did, again, a very good job of creating salarymen and bureaucrats, but not a very good job of creating scientists and artists and politicians and creative individuals. And so there's a deep look within Japan at their educational system. Mexico, if I'm familiar with, I mentioned just briefly that the National University of Mexico is rated #1 in South America, but it's 221 on the world rankings. And so they had to come down and speak and wanted to know, how come we're 221? What should we do about this? So my suggestion was, what you should do is develop your own ranking system. Get a ranking system that makes much more sense for South America, because we already have the global system. My own university, where I am now, is a small regional university in the mountains, very pretty little place, but it doesn't get ranked as a national university, but it gets ranked very well for small, pretty universities, because it's number 20 on outdoor recreation universities. So students come to go skiing and to study environmental sciences and to have a small experience at a small university in a little ski town. And so again, it's a very good university for what it does. And so it doesn't have to be ranked at the university. Right now I'm working with a colleague in Saudi Arabia. We're doing a paper on the Princess Noor University. If you don't know, that's the largest women's university in the world. There are 45,000 women in Saudi Arabia. And it's most amazing, you have 45,000 women, which means 10,000 women are graduating every year and have no place to work. So they're building this enormous problem of educating women, but there's no match to the economy. So it's a very good university, but it doesn't mix with the economy very well. And so there are some differences in the problems. And of course, the culture is extremely unique because of Saudi Arabia as well. So next slide, please. So some of the themes that emerged from this particular study, I think, are interesting, and this as far as the globalization issues. Saudi Arabia wants to be part of the global academic world, and how can they be part of that, and part of the Arab world? What's the role of the public sphere? I talked about just a little bit. Their obstacles, surprisingly, are financial. One doesn't think of Saudi Arabia as having financial problems, but no matter how much money you have to decide how to distribute it. And so some of the universities feel they're not getting their share of the money. And then, of course, there are huge social and cultural issues that are unique to Saudi Arabia. So it's interesting for me to be invited to Saudi Arabia to talk about what I think is a university for them. And it's so unique as far as the cultural issues to deal with. Women's issues are extremely important, especially working at this at the Princess Noor University. And the teaching curriculum, again, I had the same problem of the liberalized versus vocational. So next slide. So what are the solutions? Well, my solution is to go snowboard. You're supposed to laugh. So this is me at one of our mountains. That's about a half hour from where I live. So I'm a snowboarder. In my other life, I'm also director of the ski patrol. So for me, this is how I clear my head, and this is how I do my research and my thinking about getting away from everything and going up and going skiing. So if you don't have skiing available to you, here's some other solutions though. Institutional autonomy. Again, culturally, how autonomous should the university be from the federal system or itself? And again, back to the triangles again, what sort of culture do you have? Are you an independent culture, or are you a collectivistic culture? And so it depends on how much autonomy you need. Is faculty self-governance a good idea? In some places it is, in some places it needs to be very much shared with the hierarchy. What about expanded choices? This is the idea that the university should have a broad number of scientific options and academic options for its students. What's the role of research? Should we promote research in all universities, or some universities have more research than others? My particular university, where I am now, is a regional university, and the idea is that it should study regional problems. It doesn't have to do global problems. It should study regional problems, the environment, how's the skiing industry, who are the students, where are they going? And so we can be a very good university if we're studying local problems. How do we escape from the market? This is the idea that we're not doing universities just so students can get jobs. That's an important point. In some universities, that can be their main function. But other universities, it's to preserve the culture and to be part of the public debate. And so again, what's the balance? Not every university has to do everything. The same thing with globalization. And we talked about quality assurance as well. Next slide. So what are some conclusions? And I think I have lots of questions. I don't have a lot of answers, but I think these are things that you should consider for yourselves. Is what's the social and economic role of the university? We have both a social function and we have an economic function. And what should the balance be? How do we build a university? What are the differences between developed and developing countries? Again, some universities in developing countries are going to be at different levels than others. In our country, in the United States, that some of our states are developing states, and some of our states are more developed. So we have differences even in the United States as far as the education systems. Again, some of the purposes are how do we reduce income inequality? What's the role of research for the social good and the public good? And the cultural appropriateness of universities. Again, this is the idea of what's the social function of higher education for a country? And then the funny thing for us in the United States, this is American football teams in the United States are so important. And in fact, if you notice back to the rankings are somewhat similar to who has the most successful American football programs as well, because it's so important. But that's okay. Again, what's the larger function of the university? And what's the role of sports, at least for us in the United States? And then what are some of the postmodern problems? Again, what are the problems with equity issues? Who has access? Are we allowing access by different social classes, different racial groups, different regional groups as well? What are the social, intellectual, and research development ideas of the university? And again, what's the role of cultural preservation and national sovereignty? Again, it's important that we act as independent countries and to preserve our own culture while we participate in the larger global discussion of things. So I'll just leave us with some final questions. Is that one basic question to ask ourselves is, so what problems is the university solving? Is it solving cultural problems, social problems, economic problems? And obviously it's solving all of those. And how do we participate in those? And what's the university of the future? The idea that do we divide up into systems? Do we specialize? Can one university be everything? And then who will do the teaching and who will do the learning? And how do we choose faculty and how do we choose students? Again, this is part of quality assurance. And then who find the benefits? Is that are we looking at the private good, at the public good, and how do we participate in the public sphere? And this is Big's final question. This is what I always used to ask. Is it, any other burning questions? So I'm not sure how much time we have. We have for a couple of questions.